currently not broadcast live on YouTube, unfortunately. That's my own technical hitch. So just to for those of you who have just joined us, we are the Singapore Hub for Systems Innovation. And today's discussion and kind of panel is around understanding inequality from a systems perspective. So it's quite a broad topic, and we'll kind of hear from our three guests. Before we go into that, just a very kind of brief introduction to us. We started our hub around March this year, and we're part of the SI community. I'm sure many of you are actually from that community. So we just introduce ourselves. I'm Marissa, and I'm the lead for the Singapore Hub, and I've got with us, well, I've got with me here, we have with us here also our my fellow organising team who work really hard in bringing our Singapore Hub to life. And I don't know if you want to share couple of words about yourself. I come from an innovation space, but the other two also have their own short kind of versions of their story. Anna, would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, thanks, Marissa. In my background, I'm a scientist. But about 6 years ago, I made a career change into sustainability, and after a while, met Marissa, and so we're business partners, and we co-founded sustainability-led innovation firm. So we work with organizations. Although we are Singapore founded company, we work around the globe and help organizations of different kinds with various aspects of sustainability. But what really is of key to us is using systems thinking and systems perspective in helping organizations to address their challenges. And that's why we're here. Wesley, your turn.
All right, thanks, Anna. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wesley Boers, originally from Belgium. Also have an innovation background, so I graduated as an engineer biochemistry. Worked quite some time in fast-moving consumer goods. With that, in R&D and innovation, I started with product chemistry, but actually I got very interested in the people chemistry, so how teams are formed and collaboration dynamics, etc. And that brought me to becoming a certified coach and also a systemic coach. And since I discovered systemic coaching, I'm quite hooked into this system perspective of things, looking at the whole, looking at the needs of system, looking at the dynamics within systems, and on that path, I got in touch with Marissa and Anna, and also here to support the Singapore Hub. And that's it for me in a nutshell. So enjoy the session. And back to you, Marissa.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wesley. Thanks, Anna. So we don't really want to go too much into detail about ourselves or the hub again. I think many of you know us, and if you don't, then you'll find out more as you kind of, I guess, become more entrenched into the SI community. You can also kind of find more information about us, about SI in general, on the Mighty Networks platform and the SI e-learning platform. So those are the main two, and obviously we have a number of hubs around the world. We have 20 sort of independent but related hubs that are here to bring to life a lot of the ideas and thinking around systems innovation, systems thinking, complexity. It's quite a big umbrella, but I think what brings us together is most of us have this kind of interest and curiosity around these topics and see that they're very much needed for the way that we see the world and the way that we address a lot of the challenges that we're facing as society evolves. So without further ado, there's a QR code. Without further ado, we'll go into kind of hearing more from our panelists today. And for most of you, I think you know that we have three. Sorry, Anna, go on.
Yeah, I just want to ask everyone, maybe before we go in, the word inequality, right? It brings something different for every one of us. So may we ask you to, whatever comes to you as we go along, just put in the chat, what is it for you when we say inequality? Thanks.
Great, thanks, Anna. Okay. So there's a QR code in case any of you aren't members. I'm sure most of us are anyway. And then we will go into our sort of panel session from here on in. Oh, sorry, there we go. So we will be introducing our guests one at a time, and we've asked them to, we've kind of got this overarching question that we're looking to address. And just to kind of as a recap, this is the first of a series of 3 parts that we're looking at. And one part is this panel session. Our next session on the 22nd of September is kind of a mapping or kind of a co-creation. So hopefully you'll take what you hear from here and these panelists and these ideas, and we can bring them to our next session where we'll look at one of the canvases that the SI community has to kind of experiment with. And then the third part of the session, or the third session, will be a synthesis where we take everything that we heard, the ideas and the mapping that we have done to then kind of synthesize them into kind of I guess I think what we call leverage points. So if you are joining us today, hopefully you'll be able to make it for the other 2 sessions, because we'd really like to have that continuity so that there's a degree of kind of a thread through what you're hearing today from the panelists and the theme of inequality. Our 3 guests are Tanuja Prasad, Marissa, Kaloga, and Kok Hoe. And so we'll introduce those one at a time, and we'll have a kind of a question that we'll ask them to answer. And at the end, we've got about 20 minutes or so for a panel discussion. We'd really like to hear from you all some of the questions that arise through what they're sharing. And hopefully we'll have a nice discussion at the end. So if we can just ask you to keep yourself on mute, and especially if you've got loud background noise whilst the speakers are kind of sharing and things. But obviously towards the end, we'll have more of an open discussion. So I will stop sharing for now. And our first speaker is Tanuja. Sorry, I'm going to spotlight you, Tanuja. I hope that's okay, so everyone can see. Great, everyone. Nice. Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Tanuja. I'm looking for my notes. Here we go. So Tanuja is our first guest for today. She has a background in electrical engineering. She uses complexity science and technology as a leading tool to generate positive impact with regenerative finance and impact management. In 2020, she founded Apply Complexity, where she focuses on conducting multidisciplinary research on the application of complexity science to the impact sector. Tanuja is also a lead of impact potential analysis at Match for Action, where she has analysed social impact innovation gaps and opportunities. So thank you for joining us, Tanuja. I've heard you speak once before within the SI community. I'm really interested in what you were saying, so really glad you could join us again. So under this, thank you. Under this topic for today, our kind of first question to you is, what is the significance of or the connection to systems thinking in relation to inequality? And how can we use a systems perspective to look at inequality?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marissa. I'm going to use slides to illuminate my answer. So let me start sharing. Just give me a second.
Sure.
First of all, it's such a pleasure to see such a large audience and very diverse. So I don't think there's any inequality in this audience, I think. Okay, there you go. Is that visible, Marissa?
Yes. Yeah, perfect.
Great. So folks, in case you need to reach me after this session, my email is here. I'm happy to communicate with anyone and everyone. So what I thought I'd do is give a little bit, just, a few seconds, background on the systemic web or complex adaptive systems. So we now know with system science and complexity science that the universe is a complex adaptive system. It's not just complex, it is also complex adaptive. Yep. It is a networked web of complex adaptive elements, which creates together a dynamic, nonlinear system in which the system itself is also adaptive. Yeah. So within this understanding of the universe, what does inequality mean? If every participant is connected with every other participant, the inequality can be seen as a tension that appears within the systemic web itself. Now, that tension or that inequality could be due to exogenous forces or due to endogenous changes. And I'll show you some endogenous changes later on. But the end result, we can perceive this tension or this pull within the web as damaged connections and restricted flow of information. So I'm a techie, apologies for that. I'm the geek here. And as a geek, I try to look at it in these terms. But what's wonderful about complexity science is it doesn't tear the geekiness away from the humanity. So I am a whole human being with a focus on my geeky side. Yeah. So taking the example of wealth inequality, which is such a big point of discussion these days, there is a tendency to think of wealth inequality that needs to be flattened out. That means there should be no wealth inequality. But this is a dynamic universe. We live in a dynamic space. We live dynamic lives. So there will always be inequalities, and that will appear within societies. It will increase, decrease, etc. But as a whole, what we want to go from is the pyramid, which is very much a representation these days of how wealth is distributed within societies, which I'm sure you've heard. We need to move from a pyramid format to a diamond format where the number of people at the bottom and the number of people at the top are small, and that the middle class is large. This will give the largest opportunity and the least amount of social violence, which is a very important point. Inequality engenders violence. Inequality of any sort engenders violence. The big piece here, to me, the big piece that stands out is that our financial systems, our economic systems today are structured in such a way as to create pyramids, as to create pyramidic distributions. And what we want is this diamond distribution. From a systems perspective, the question that comes to mind is, what are the parameters within our financial structures that are keeping us within a pyramidic structure? So it's one of the things I'm doing, by the way, is I'm applying complexity science to finance and coming up with rules or metrics for regenerative finance, where financial products can be used to not only reduce inequalities, but actually to increase opportunities for the lower class to rise to middle class. So I want to give a little example here. Oh, sorry, Anna, would you give me a 3-minute heads up, please? Thank you. I was playing the famous capitalistic game called Monopoly. Now, Monopoly starts with, I think, $500 per player, but I don't recall anymore. So we were 4 players. We went around, I think, 5 or 6 rounds, and nobody could afford to buy a hotel. Yeah. So in the next round, we started with $1,500. So that's 3 times the initial amount. Within 2 rounds, everybody was able to buy a hotel. What that says is that the system itself has certain thresholds, also known as non-linearities, which was preventing individuals from rising to a certain level. So when we go today, like in the United States, where there's a large discussion about minimum wage, there could be that threshold where increasing minimum wage by $1 will increase the possibility of opportunity by 100 times, because the system itself has certain properties, certain characteristics that we as systems thinkers and as policy designers, as government agencies need to be aware of. This is not a moral issue. This is not somebody up there who is keeping everybody down. The system itself has certain properties. So I'll move on to another example, gender inequality. Now, this is something that's close to my heart. But gender inequality is not similar to wealth inequality in its characteristics. It is a different thing entirely. So gender is a polarity, male energies, female energies, male characteristics or parameters, and female. They are not pitted against each other. They don't work against each other. So gender equality doesn't mean to wipe out the difference. It means to increase the connection, increase the knowledge of what these two polarities are doing and how they work together in a complex system. So the example I want to give is about walking. When we walk, the back foot pushes forward, yeah? But the front foot is creating stability and a slight motion backwards. So the backward motion of the front foot creates stability such that the back foot can push forward. If the front foot were also pushing forward, we would just fall on our faces. So the polarity, what looks like opposing forces, are actually creating a stable system. And that's how we must view gender, as a polarity that coexists within a whole to create a larger dynamic of the whole itself. Yep. So I want to go a little bit about policy design and government, or this can also translate to societies in general, to societal organizations like religious organizations or corporations. So this is my work, and one of the things I do is I do simulations. So for those of you who know agent-based models, this black square there, this is the result of an agent-based model simulation. I looked at societies which are never randomly distributed, as you probably know. Societies are created as connected clusters. So I am connected to my friends and my family. Each member within the friend and family is connected to other friends and families. And so we live in a network society of clusters. But then we design policies such that we assume a random distribution. And the result of such a policy design is that there can be entire communities that can be sidelined, that can be ignored because of the way we apply the mathematics to it. Yeah. The famous example of this is Schelling's segregation model, where he showed that within a community of homes, we can produce a racially segregated output, which is that red and blue square, even though no individual within the community is actually racist. And that is due to the way the individuals connect with each other. So once again, no individual is racist, but the output could be a racist segregated society. Yeah. That's the end of my slides. What I wanted to say here, though, is as systems thinkers, as systems innovators, the role systems thinking can play, should play in the future, should be even larger than it is today. Did the screen just go blank? Yeah, there it is, the last slide. This is our greatest opportunity, I think. The pandemic, it is clear, has already and will for the next, I don't know how many years, create massive disruptions. But because the way that the pandemic is flowing, as well as the way the healthcare is being distributed, there are going to be massive inequalities that will appear in the structure and the structure of opportunities for individuals across the world. This is something systems thinking should step up and look into. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Tanuja. Nice to hear from you. We will now hear from Marissa, and we'll also obviously get some questions going as well as we go through this. So Anna, would you like to introduce Marissa, and I'll just leave it to you. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks, Tanuja. You were early. Bravo. Thank you. That was really interesting. Our next speaker is Dr. Marissa Kaloga, and she's a lecturer and assistant professor at the University of Otago. I will not pronounce the word. I don't know how to say it, Maori. I'm sorry, from New Zealand. Her community-based research focuses on inclusive entrepreneurship and how to promote social and economic justice through coordinated systems change. She has conducted research in Africa, Asia, North America, and Oceania with diverse communities that include sex workers, refugees, and women in extreme poverty. And I have an opening question for Marissa. Many of us might not experience inequality in our daily lives, but you, Marissa, through your research, found something different. Can you please tell us more about the many faces of inequality and its wider implications on society at large, and how it is everyone's business, in fact?
Kia ora tātou, ko Kaloga tōku whanau, ko Marissa tōku ingoa. It is Māori Language Week, and so I decided I would go ahead and just introduce myself very briefly in Te Reo Māori. So yes, thank you for having me so much. Thank you, Marissa and Anna, for inviting me and for hosting this important meeting. I'm looking forward to sharing some ideas with you. And I loved listening to Tanuja, and I'm looking forward to the other presenter as well as the amazing people that I keep seeing pop up in the waiting room, and I'm very excited to hear from them as well. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about why inequality is an important subject of discussion and why it's important to talk about it from a systems perspective. And then I'll share a little bit of my research with you, which looks at inequality specific to entrepreneurial ecosystems. So why does inequality matter? It's important to answer that very basic question for us to really think about why are we talking about this in the first place. So the first reaction often is a moral judgment that inequality matters because it's not fair that some people have more and some people have less. Other people might counter this and say, yes, but that's kind of the natural order that some people have more and some people have less. This can't be helped. It's the idea that poverty will always be around to a certain degree and we can't really get rid of it. And of course, yes, to some degree, this is true, like what Tanuja has shown us with the diamond model. People will fall on hard times and some people will not have what they need. And that's why they have things like social work and community work. But there's two additional points that are important to make. And it's that here we're talking about systemic inequality, not individual inequality. And so that means that we're looking at the structures and networks that operate beyond an individual's capacity to change or to impact change. And so poverty, whether it's economic poverty, social poverty, spiritual poverty, et cetera, we might reference as structural or systemic. And second is that initial gut feeling of it's not fair is a really important thing to explore and not to just kind of negate it as kind of a childish response. The idea of fairness is at the heart of justice. And it's something that's explored most famously by scholars like John Rawls or Amartya Sen. And social and community work, the field that I lecture in, has a triple commitment to justice, similar to what you would see in the SDGs around economic, social, and environmental. Human systems crave justice. Think about all of the philosophical texts and all of the religious texts that write extensively on what is just and fair. So beyond the theoretical ideas, each of us can recollect a time when we witnessed an injustice occur even when it wasn't occurring to us, we have a visceral reaction. A child might stamp their foot and shout, "That's not fair." And kind of going back to what Tanuja spoke about earlier, the idea of monopoly is actually such a wonderful metaphor. It was created by a woman named Elizabeth Magee based on an economist's writings, Henry George's writings, and it was intended to elicit that type of response of, it's not fair. It was intended as a cautionary tale, originally called the landlord's game, as a way to help people to understand how the system is rigged against the common person. And so a lot of us have had those moments playing Monopoly where you get up and rage quit or storm out. And that feeling, that preoccupation with fairness and justice that we have as people can be extended to the idea of systemic injustice. So just as you might have that reflex against injustice, human systems also react negatively to inequality. So in the last 10 years, there's been a flood of research looking at the relationships, indeed the causal relationships between population-wide income and wealth inequality and health impacts. The most famous of these studies are by Wilkinson and Pickett, and there's an amazing TED Talk you can watch to get more detail about that. But many others have also occurred, and it's created a compelling body of evidence that shows that higher rates of inequality are positively correlated and causal to higher rates of shorter life expectancy, higher infant mortality, higher rates of obesity, higher rates of HIV infection prevalence, increased property crime, increased rates of violence, increased teen pregnancy, decrease in women's equality, decrease in child well-being, increase in school dropouts, increases in mental illnesses such as depression, increase in suicide, decrease in social cohesion and social capital. And that's actually not a comprehensive list. There's additional studies that show additional health impacts. And so while marginalized communities feel these effects more strongly, it's crucial to remember that these are actually population-wide increases. So if you are a rich person who lives in an unequal community, you have a higher prevalence or a higher risk of having these negative health effects. And that is why it's important to be having this conversation today. And so when we think about structural inequality and systemic inequality, it's important to understand that it's not an us and a them, it's definitely a we. And that's why that systems lens is so important. So yes, why is it important? So inequality can't be attributed to an individual, right? It's a relational word. So we can only be unequal in relation to one another. So when we talk about inequality, we're already using that relational lens, but it isn't quite the entire story. So it makes me think of the Rumi, the quote that's associated with Rumi that says that you think because you understand one, you must also understand two because one and one make two, but you must also understand and, right? So this idea that we have to understand how things are connected. And so you can imagine two people, we'll call them Adam and Leo. Adam has $100, Leo has zero. The and is the relationship between these two people that results in inequality. And the situation here is lovely because Adam and Leo are brothers. Adam gives Leo $50 and now they're equal. More than you can imagine actually, because Adam and Leo are my sons and they're also identical twins. But the conceptual idea of two people is lovely in its simplicity, but it's when we scale it up and we look across populations of people, the relations to one another combine and create the type of complex systemic inequality that Tanuja was referencing, that everyone here is interested in. So we can't so easily separate these relationships or come up with easy solutions now. And that's where systems thinking about inequality becomes critical. So I want to talk to you now, and how many minutes do I have left, Anna?
About 7 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about my research, the thing that I told Marissa on the last Zoom. I could talk about this for hours, so you'll have to definitely cut me off. So I'm interested in entrepreneurship research, and people often are like, you're a social worker, you're a community development person. Why are you so interested in entrepreneurship? And the reason is that it really comes back to making change. So in social work, what we're trying to do is make positive change, to intervene, to come up with a better tomorrow. And those are a lot of the same types of impulses and ideas that we have in entrepreneurship as well. Being able to look around at what's available and create something that's better than what was before. And so in my PhD research, I actually worked with women's groups in Guinea, West Africa, looking at women's cooperative savings groups and doing whole network analyses to understand how they were able to leverage the social capital generated in their groups to be able to start businesses. After that work, I came back to the US and worked as the Director of Innovation for the Economic and Community Development Institute, which is a large microfinance and entrepreneurship organization in the US that works with people from all walks of life and specifically geared towards people from marginalized and underrepresented groups. So that word should be a red flag to you. An underrepresented group alerts you to a possible systemic issue. So entrepreneurship is a systemically unequal field. And research in Silicon Valley, for example, is conclusive that it is so, but this is echoed elsewhere. So I'm really interested in it because it's a critical pathway for changing the systemic wealth inequality because it disrupts intergenerational patterns of exclusion and inequality. And the creativity and the potential for creating different future systems is inherent. Entrepreneurs help create the future. So during another Fulbright-funded research trip to Guinea, I looked at similar structural inequality and access to entrepreneurship training and funds. Here in Ōtepoti Dunedin right now, I'm working with several colleagues to complete a sociometric network study that looks at the relationship between entrepreneurial support organization in the city and the demographics of their clientele. So we're really interested in, we've mapped out the relationships between the entrepreneurial ecosystem players and are looking at now talking with the entrepreneurs themselves to understand, people are underrepresented. The organizations aren't serving those populations in the same way. What needs to change from the perspective of the people who are not accessing the services, and how can we intervene through systems innovation approaches to make that system more inclusive. So I'll leave it there and looking forward very much to people's questions further on and hearing the other speaker as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marissa. That was really very interesting and much earlier than the time is out. So we'll have more time for questions. That's brilliant. Thank you. Marissa, would you like to, or Wesley, would you like to introduce our third speaker?
No worries, no worries. Okay, thanks, Anna. Let me also get my notes. And my kids come in at the moment, so maybe you hear some background noise on my side. So always a nice systemic evolution here. So yeah, last but not least, let me have the honor to introduce Dr. Kok Hoe from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. So his specialist topics are focused on many aspects of government and civil society, with particular interest in retirement income security, minimum income standards, social housing policy, and homelessness. And his research is widely published, and he's an active public speaker and educator. So welcome, Dr. Kok Hoe. And a question for you, an opening question, is that Singapore is widely known for its robust and successful public housing policy that was designed to minimize equality and provide every Singaporean with an affordable roof over their head. Dr. Kok Hoe, through your research, what did you find and what effect did social housing policy have over the years on equality in Singapore? Thank you.
Thank you, Wesley, and thank you to the team for the invitation to speak. Let me just share my slides. Get this going. Today I'm going to speak on the specific case of public housing policy. I say this is a case because I'm hoping that by diving into some of the specificities of policy design and housing inequality in Singapore can help to get the conversation going about how policies are often a huge driver in the experiences of inequality. So we're going to use public housing in Singapore as a case. I'll be drawing from some of the research I've been doing in this area in the last few years. And I work in a public policy school, so my attention is always on policy design. And for today's session, I'll be drawing from a piece I wrote with several collaborators at the National University of Singapore, which was a report on Singapore's public housing system for the UN Habitat. That report is freely available to download online. So I'll be drawing some highlights from this report. I thought it would be interesting to talk about public housing in Singapore because it is often known to be a contributing factor to low inequality, right? The opposite of what we are interested in studying here. People think of Singapore's public housing system as a huge contributing factor to equality. Right? Why is that so? Because it's often thought of as an almost universal housing system because of its size, right? And that didn't happen by accident, right? In the mid 1980s, a policy goal and which then it morphed into something of a national campaign and a national project, which was to make everyone in Singapore a homeowner, right? So in the president's address, which is equivalent to perhaps a Queen's speech in the UK, the president announced that for the next 5 years, my government's objectives will be to aim for 80% home ownership by 1989, as the next stage towards 100% homeowning society by 1999. Right? This has always struck me as a very ambitious statement to declare, right? Because 100% is absolute. If there's one household that doesn't own the housing, you would have failed. But I think it signals the kind of how buoyant the mood was then, because home ownership figures had been rising for a while, right, leading up to the 1980s. So this became a national goal that every Singaporean should be a homeowner. Right? This policy objective actually has two parts. One is, of course, home ownership, but the unspoken part of this objective was that this will be a home owning society that depends mainly on public housing. Right? Because, of course, people can be homeowners in the private housing system, meaning they can buy private housing. But in Singapore, this was a national project, both in terms of making everyone a homeowner, but also that most of the housing that they own should be built by the state, right? Which made it a very unique project. To deliver this project, it meant that if you wanted everybody to be a homeowner, and most of them should be owning public housing, then you needed to build a lot of public housing, which was what the government did, right? Over a fairly short period of time. This is a very remarkable trend. Housing right now is one of the most controversial areas of public policy in many cities, right? Where for various reasons, lack of resources, bureaucratic capacity constraints, and so on, many cities struggle to deliver just housing units, right? But within a fairly short period of time, they ramped up the housing stock in Singapore. This is public housing stock built by the state, more than 10 times. It really is quite remarkable. Right? There is a whole story about how they funded this, right? Because the question is, where did the money come from? I won't go into details here, but if it comes up during the Q&A, we can talk about it. But in any case, the housing stock really grew at a very quick rate. And just to contextualize how unique that situation is, I say unique because it's not necessarily good or bad that most housing stock in the country is public housing. It's a neutral thing. It has its pros and its cons, but it is what it is. Right? If we look at public or social housing as a percentage of the total housing stock in different places, it's really high in Singapore. Right? So 73% of all housing in Singapore is built by the state. Right? In a few other places, which are very well known for the huge social housing programs, like the Netherlands is about a third. Hong Kong has a very well regarded public housing program, it's about 29%. So really very dominant, right, public housing in Singapore. So the question is, if public housing was so widely available, how does it create inequality? Right? Well, the first thing to note is, if this was to be a home ownership system, meant that people had to buy their housing. And that immediately introduces market mechanisms into the housing system, right? So public housing in Singapore, the bulk of it is built by the state, but is sold and allocated according to market principles. The first transaction from the state to the individual household is highly subsidized, but from then on, that unit, that flat, can be freely traded on the property market, just like any other private housing, right? Subject to a few rules, right? But by and large, they trade on free market principles, right? On the agreed price between buyer and seller. So if that's the case, we shouldn't be surprised that even within the public housing system, there is quite a lot of inequality in terms of the types of public housing that people actually own, right? Because public housing is not one thing. In fact, there is quite a long menu of different housing types. So this chart compares different types of housing that households own along different points of the household income distribution. And you can see very clearly, right, that households that have higher income are also more likely to own more expensive housing, right? So here you can see how the various HDB refers to the Housing Authority in Singapore, the Housing and Development Board. So that's all public housing. You can see how the various public housing flat types blend almost seamlessly into private housing types in terms of the skew, right? So at the bottom of the income distribution, people are far more likely to live in the smallest public housing, 1 or 2 room flats, very unlikely to live in public housing. As you go up the continuum, the opposite is very visible. So that's the first thing we notice. Once we allow public housing to be traded freely on the market, we should not be surprised that people's means will determine the type of public housing they get, right? And just now I already mentioned there are different types of public housing available for purchase. Again, that was not an accident. It was very much part of policy design. This chart I'm showing you now is about the number of different flat types that was built for sale, right, by the state between 1970 and 2015. And you can see a very clear pattern, which is that over time, there were successive waves of larger flat types being introduced, right? So a part of this mirrors how Singapore's very compressed economic development and people's rising living standards, but you can see how the direction of building and housing development was very much towards larger and larger flat types. 3-room flats were introduced in the 70s, followed by 4-room flats in the 80s, 5-room flats in the 90s, and so on. Successive waves of larger and larger flat types. So the overall trend of flats that were built for sale by the state can be summed up by more and larger, essentially, right? More and larger. Now, if you keep in mind this picture that we're looking at, that is in fact not the whole public housing system. I've been speaking of flats built by the state and then being sold to individual households. But actually, historically, public housing in Singapore was built to be let, right? They were built as a rental housing system. They were not initially for sale. The home ownership project came into the picture slightly later. But over time, social housing, right, meaning subsidized housing, to be differentiated from housing that the government builds to sell. Social housing refers to housing that the government builds to let. So they become landlord and not just housing developer. So the Housing Authority in Singapore does both of those things. They are landlord of social subsidized housing to lower income households, but they are also a developer of housing that sells flats to the majority of the population. So what happened to the stock of social housing, subsidized rental housing? The trend was very much in the opposite direction of sold flats. Over time, the larger flat types decrease in number. And if you take a cross section in the 1970s, on what was available to rent on a subsidized basis, you can see there were a few options. But come 2015, essentially the entire social housing system was only 2 types of flats, 1-room flats and 2-room flats. That's local terminology. 1-room flats are in fact studio flats with no bedrooms. 2-room flats are in fact a 1-bedroom flat, right? Because the Housing Authority counts the living room as a room. So essentially, the story of social housing is fewer and smaller over time. If I combine those 2 graphs, this is what it looks like in the 100% chart. I mentioned historically, the public housing system in Singapore started off entirely as a social housing system where flats were only available to rent. But over time, because of the home ownership project, the rental stock decreased very sharply down to the 20s, down to the 10%, and currently only 5 to 6% of the public housing stock. The majority of the stock are flats for sale. Again, not an accident, very much orchestrated through policy decisions. There were about 2.5 decades when the decision was made that the housing authority will only demolish social housing units, but not replace them with new units. Right. So the remaining stock not only was smaller of social housing, they were also older because they were not being replaced by new social housing units. So this was very much a plan. Why such a plan? The idea was that if you wanted to encourage home ownership, you should not then provide an alternative. Right? If you wanted everyone to be a homeowner, then you should keep social housing, which is the alternative to home ownership, to an absolute minimum. So that was very much the strategy, right? So on the one hand, we have what I like to call aspirational housing for homeowners, very iconic housing projects, award-winning housing projects. They were building larger, more beautiful flats that came closer and closer to, well, they were mimicking private housing options, condominium units and so on. But at the bottom end of the housing menu, not only were social housing units fewer to come by and older, they also became smaller, right? So here, to just give us a sense, on the left is a typical social housing unit. It's a one-room flat. You can see from the floor plan there is in fact no bedroom, no separate bedroom. It's one open space with a small kitchen measuring about 35 square meters. The largest flat that's available for sale measures 140 square meters, right? So that is the inequality that currently resides in the public housing system. We often talk about, refer to this as the residualisation of social housing, meaning that social housing becomes a residual option, the very last option when you have no other choice. That has become the place of social housing now in Singapore's public housing system, that only people who have no other choice will live in it because it's old and it's small. Right. And not only that, the experience of accessing social housing has also been very difficult. You can see this across a few dimensions. Because the stock of social housing is so small, gatekeeping has had to be very tight. So the income limit, the means test, the income ceiling has not been revised since 2003. Right. Considering inflation, right, that means that it has become much stricter. Much more difficult to qualify for social housing, right? There are also some fairly irrational rules. When elderly people apply for social housing, the housing authority in fact assesses the housing arrangements of the elderly person's children to see if there are spare bedrooms in which the elderly person can live. That can affect the eligibility of the elderly person to social housing. Because the stock is small, and gatekeeping is tight, many people do not qualify, and so every year many people file appeals, right, for the applications to be reconsidered. That has required discretionary practices where the housing authority has had to look at each individual case to decide whether people should qualify. A lot of these discretionary practices are not transparent. And of course, long wait times because stock is low. I've mentioned overcrowding because the space in the flat is so limited. Right? About 40% of rental households, of tenant households, have 3 or more people, right, living in flats that are so small. And they also experience a lot of housing insecurity because tenures are short. Generally, people are given 2-year tenures that they have to continually renew. Right? If the household's income increases, the rent also will increase, right, to encourage exit from the social housing system into home ownership. So I will conclude here to bring our attention back again to the national project of home ownership and almost universal home ownership, right? And how, in fact, within this national project of home ownership, there was designed into this project a tiny residual social housing system that has been very inadequate and difficult to access. How this tiny social housing system in fact plays an outsized role to drive home ownership in Singapore. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Marissa, I think it's time for some questions, I guess.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kok Hoe. Thank you, Marissa, and thank you, Tanuja. So much to think about. I don't even know where to start myself. I'm sure the audience has some questions. I know the panelists also may have some questions for each other. Tanuja, you're nodding, I can see. Would you have a question that you would like to pose?
Yes.
Sure, go ahead.
Kok Hoe. So the home ownership, what comes to mind from a systemic perspective is if I think of it from an individual person or family, if I am a renter versus I am looking to buy, then in order to buy, there's a certain amount of money that I need to have saved. So there is a threshold amount of money required, which means that it supports a certain type of personality that is willing to and able to save. Yeah. So was the government's goal to create a certain type of society that is less mobile? So if I buy a house, I'm not going to move every year, obviously. To create a less mobile society, or conversely, is the data analytics that the government is doing, which I'm sure they're doing, yeah, is the data analytics showing that a less mobile society creates greater social stability, perhaps, maybe stronger communities, or even a more stable job market? Could that be any of the parameters under consideration?
Yeah. Really very sharp observations, Tanuja. The question as to how people manage to afford housing is a good one. It's not so much down to saving habit. The Singapore government doesn't leave many things to chance, so it doesn't bank on people's saving tendencies. Saving is made mandatory. Right, so the resources for purchasing housing in fact comes from mandatory savings that every employee has to put into a central provident fund, which is in fact a mandatory pension instrument. It's a retirement income instrument. But the logic was that, well, if you're going to put money into individual savings accounts for retirement, the money is sitting in your individual accounts for 40 years during your working life, when you are not retired yet. Why don't we let people purchase housing using that money? So that's how 80% of the population are able to afford housing, public housing specifically. So that's how. But as for why, so there was also a question on the chat. Why did the government want to promote home ownership? There are various reasons for this. One is that Singapore has a very incomplete social welfare system. So mandating savings and encouraging people to turn that into housing investment is a way to take care of people's long-term income security. So it addresses that social welfare gap. The other reason is political. Just as you've mentioned, policymakers have said that they notice that homeowners are less likely to vote against the sitting government because they want, well, first of all, if you are servicing a long-term mortgage, you're less likely to go on strike. So that's labor peace. And if you're concerned about property prices, you're less likely to want political turbulence. So you keep the government in place, right? So there were various considerations. Thanks for your question.
Great, thank you. Anna, did you have a question?
Well, thank you very much. That's super interesting. I was actually would like to ask a more kind of open question, generic question for all three of you. The system, whatever that is that you described, is serving something. And what would you say, what order or which order is then maintained here by the existing system?
Can you, Anna, can you speak a little bit more to the word order? What do you mean by it?
Wesley, maybe you want to elaborate?
Happy to do so. Like in systemic coaching, if you look at the system, every system has a certain function for the greater whole. So it needs to do something, exchange something, otherwise there's no reason for existing. So if there is a certain function of a system, within the system, all the parts have a certain role to play, and there's a certain order. So like, for example, a nursing home, you might say that the nurses have the leading function. So they're first in the order, because in a nursery home, it's all about well-being. Whilst in a hospital, it's more about, simplistically speaking, curing patients. So there, the leading function in the order are the MDs and the physicians. So that's a bit the order of systems. So with the current status, I think that's the question of Anna, with how the systems are, or your systems, what is actually safeguarded here or maintained at this moment.
I can speak to that a little bit, in particular because the work that I do is very applied, right? So rather than studying systems, we intervene. And interestingly enough, it's a very chicken and egg problem, because you study systems to be able to intervene, but you learn about systems by actually intervening and being quite, reflective about what your intervention actually does. And in that way, you learn more about them, and in that way, you can intervene again. So it's very iterative. But when we're talking about, for example, we'll talk specifically about the entrepreneurial ecosystem that I'm working with right now. One of the important things is that it's not necessarily to an end that people are aware of, right? So a lot of times systems, especially ones that are unequal social systems, are created, again, not by anyone's intent, but have those kind of balancing loops that keep perpetuating them, right? And unless there's very targeted, coordinated systems change, they will keep perpetuating those loops, even if it's not the best system for the majority of people. And it may not even be the type of thing that people are aware of. And so making those systems visualized for people, or making those mental models clearer through the creation of system dynamics models, then allows a really important conversation to happen, to say that, is what's happening what we want to have happen, right? And there's lots of different ways to get to that, but I do think that using system science is a really good one when you're intervening at a community level, because oftentimes, such as what we're finding here, people aren't necessarily aware of the cumulative effects of all of their actions together. So even if they're not coordinating those actions still have those cumulative effects. And so making it quite clear then allows us to think, okay, what do we actually want to do? And how can we collectively make that happen intentionally, rather than having this unintentional set of circumstances that we are currently perpetuating?
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you. Thanks, Marissa. I have a question, and I'll save it though, because I think some other people have questions. One quite significant question is, well, okay, so Steve, are you here? Would you like to ask your question, Steve, or shall I ask it for you?
You're
Sure.
welcome to go through it.
Okay, great. So, Stephen, I'm interested to get your perspective, Marissa, on the New Zealand government's wellbeing budget. The New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has recently unveiled a new approach to running the government's finances by delivering a wellbeing government budget as a distinct one from the GDP-only government budget. The Wellbeing's budget purpose is to broaden the budget's focus beyond just economic and fiscal policy by using the Treasury's Living Standards framework to inform the government's investment priorities and funding decisions. And this will hopefully demonstrate a much more systemic measure of success across all of society. So I guess Steve's asking for your perspective on that particular intervention, on that particular way of addressing well-being in society.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good start, right? Conceptually, it's a good start, and there's a lot of conversations happening not only around the well-being budget, but around a lot of different ideas around well-being in Aotearoa, New Zealand. A lot of people use the Te Whare Tapawha model of spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical health to understand what well-being actually means. And I think that type of a model is gaining just a general acceptance and understanding kind of more publicly. And that's really kind of a part of the idea of steering a budget towards well-being rather than just economic gain. And we're seeing that a lot in the social procurement that's happening, in being able to evaluate things by social impacts, impact evaluations and things like that. We're certainly not actualizing on all of those goals yet. And I know that there are criticisms as far as how effective it's been or how real it is. But there seems to be a cumulative movement towards experimenting with other ways of measuring success. So I think I take a wait and see approach a little bit to see what all of those cumulative movements really steer us towards and how effective that ends up being.
Sorry, just whilst you're here, Marissa, I have one kind of question I wanted to pose. And you talked about kind of inequality being relational, right? And I think that's interesting. I guess the more interconnected we become through technology, especially, do you see that and I'm going to use the word perception, I don't think it's a perception, but our personal perceptions of inequality are kind of augmented or heightened because of the technology or because of that, whilst there's also this other part that you mentioned where you kind of said we're not aware of the cumulative effect. And so it's almost this sense of, okay, the more we know and see these cumulative effects, the more we're connected to each other, the more we become aware of it. I mean, what do you think about kind of those kind of two, I don't know if we want to call them polarities, I think somebody talked about that earlier. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we each have our own personal experiences with how we expose ourselves to social media and what that does. I'm certainly not a researcher in that area, but I think the research does suggest that there can be very negative impacts of seeing curated versions of other people's lives and comparing them to the unvarnished version you know about your own. It's the same thing of looking at magazines and thinking that represents reality. But I will say that, while global communication systems have eased our ability to stay in contact with people very far away, a lot of the work that I do is much more around the local communities, in how we can relate with one another in a kind of a more local context. Because, in developing much more, high social capital, multiplex relationships, really dense networks in your local community, we're able to really be much more, how can I say this? Our empowerment and our ability to address a lot of those things doesn't happen individually anymore. So, for example, addressing complex trauma is not necessarily a thing that you do by yourself, or dealing with a lot of the things that happen to you. It's not something that you're in, your own bubble doing, but you have those relationships to be able to bolster you. And the way that occurs on that community level is going to be different depending on where you are. But that tends to be kind of more of where I see being able to, how could I say, mitigate the impacts that some of those kind of unhealthy, I don't know if they're inequalities, but unhealthy comparisons happen, to really root yourself in more of your local context rather than that kind of curated online version of the world, which is not really reflective of
less so about the technology, it's just the interconnectedness that the technology is bringing. But thank you. Jacqueline, do you have a question that you'd like to ask Kok Hoe? Would you mind unmuting and coming on board to share your question?
Hi, thanks. Just curious, Kok Hoe, from your perspective, you mentioned housing as a specific case. Just curious about any other examples, just one or two outside of housing, to really show some of the interconnectedness and how inequality is kind of structural beyond housing in itself.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Because my attention is fixed on housing, right? Often I see how housing inequality has impact on other domains of life. This has always been clear. We've always been aware of how constraints on space, and we don't feel it if space is not an issue. But when space is an issue, then it becomes very clear that it affects, for example, parenting and children's education. That kids don't have a space, a quiet space at home to study and to do their homework, often means that they either don't do their homework or they go out elsewhere to do it, which means that the parents are not able to supervise them. So that has always been clear, but during the past year, I think you know where I'm going with this, with home-based learning being such a huge part of so many families' lives around the world. The fact of some families not having any space at all. I mean, it's a flat with no bedrooms, right? So if you have two kids who both need to be studying, doing online lessons, and mom it needs to be in a work meeting, it's just absolutely impossible. Something has to give. So that has been very obvious in the last few years. Health has also always been an issue. Tenants in social housing have reported, research has documented quite extensively how kids living in such tight spaces are often more prone to falling sick at the same time. And one kid falls sick, all of them fall sick because they pass the illness to each other. So that's during normal times. Again, in the last 2 years, some of the safe distancing and isolation measures actually require persons who have been near to somebody suspected to be a positive case for COVID to isolate themselves in their bedroom. These flats have no bedrooms. So how do you even implement a basic public health measure like this when space is so inadequate? Right? It lacks something so basic as a bedroom. So I hope that answers your question. I start from housing, but then we see how it extends into other domains of life.
Thank you so much, Kok Hoe, for this. Yes, absolutely. I think that in the past year and a half, 2 years, running to 2 years, we've really seen inequality manifest itself in so many different ways. Just being aware of time, we're at 6:10. There's one more question, and perhaps you, Tanuja, can answer that. That would be kind of, again, a little bit more general question, but everybody are welcome to share their thoughts. What needs to be given up to find solutions?
Given up?
Given up. That's another of Wesley's questions.
Okay.
There's always a price of, either you pay the price of same or you pay the price of change. So that's a bit the.
So as systems thinkers, we don't think in terms of paying the price. We think in terms of regeneration, right? We can create change. We can go to a new place, which is an act of creation, an act of birthing. So it is much more about change rather than saying that we than a zero-sum game. It is not a zero-sum game. Okay, so I'm going to answer your question from the perspective of creativity, from the idea of innovation, essentially. So nature is by default is inherently regenerative. So using biomimicry as a model for thinking about social or even corporate change, economic change, what we need to, the new skills we need for design, and I mean design of anything, whether it's policy or anything, is the act of thinking forward. Unfortunately, now I'm an engineer, right? So although the job of an engineer is to create new things, however, my entire education was based on analysis. Analysis takes things apart, so it is a backward-looking thing. But life has to be lived forward. So life is a creative process. So unfortunately, I have no training in what can be called the essence of life itself. So what I don't need to give up anything. We need, as a whole, especially as an education system, we need to be able to step forward. We need to understand what design is. We need a lot more design thinking in our schools, but we also need to know from a systems perspective that if we're designing forward by looking backwards, then we're missing one of the critical factors of systems, and that is a phase transition. Yeah. So change in complex systems happens through tipping points. You know, the famous book, Tipping Points? Tipping points are a natural phenomenon in complex adaptive systems. So when you have crossed a tipping point, you can no longer use the data from prior to the tipping point in order to design past the tipping point. And that's where the danger is. Especially when we talk about government policy, we talk about social change, which is such a big thing now. And when we're talking about the entire social impact sector, which is trying to achieve scale, the only way to achieve scale is through tipping points. And yet we don't have a design mechanism for tipping points. That's what we need to focus on.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Tanuja. I'm afraid we are down to our last sort of couple of minutes. So we have one last closing question, and we'd like to ask you all to kind of answer, if you can, briefly. Maybe we'll start with you, Tanuja, since you're kind of under the spotlight. We've talked about so much today, and hopefully we can open the floor to another session another time. But in closing, we'd like to ask you, in one short sentence, in each of the cases that you describe, what do you think are the biggest factors that give rise to ongoing inequality? Maybe the biggest we've put, but I mean,
So in one sentence, unawareness of systemic effects. That is, unawareness of the consequences of connected systems.
Great, thank you, Tanuja. Who would like to go next? Any volunteers? Kok Hoe?
Yeah, in public policy, we're very mindful of how policies create their own constituents. So it creates stickiness and inertia, right? Because no matter how you design a policy, some people will benefit from it. And when they realize they're benefiting from it more than others, they will defend the status quo with everything they have. And that contributes to a kind of the entrenchment, right, of the inequality.
Great, thank you. Wow, really kind of insightful and articulate answers. Marissa, would you be able to share what you think are kind of the biggest factors that contribute to this?
Yeah, I think having individual people believe that they are independent from one another. I think when we see ourselves in one another and we recognize our interdependence, at that point things will change.
Great. Thank you so much to our three panelists. We've really enjoyed having you on, and again, really short on time, but hopefully we can have you back again soon and see you as part of the SI community more regularly. And thank you to everyone who came. Feel free to drop a note or a feedback in the chat box here, and this will also be uploaded onto YouTube. And apologies for the initial broadcasting live challenge that we faced. Thank you so much.
And thank you to our three hosts today. A wonderfully efficient and warm job.
Thank you, Tanuja. Thank you so much, and thanks for your time, everybody. Hope to see you all again soon. I'm going to stop recording, and I'm also going to stop broadcasting live.
I'll just say something. Thank you so much. It was really interesting, very kind of, for me at least, very unusual kind of views, perspectives, points that are not widely, again, just for me, where probably where I look for information, I haven't heard. So thank you very much. That was really interesting. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And everyone who attended.
Yeah, thank you all for making time to come.
Bye.
Okay. Stop recording.